Okay, we're still in Chapter 8, Quidditch World Cup, Part 2. And now, roared Ludo Bagman's voice, kindly put your wands in the air for the Irish national team mascots. In the next moment, what seemed to be a great green and gold comet came zooming into the stadium. It did one circuit of the stadium and then split into two smaller comets, each hurling toward the goalposts. A rainbow arced suddenly across the field, connecting the two balls of lights. The crowd oohed and awed as though it was a firework display. And now the rainbow faded and the balls of light reunited and merged. They had formed a great shimmering shamrock which rose high up into the sky and began to soar over the stands, and something like golden rain seemed to be falling from it. "Excellent!" yelled Ron as the shamrock soared over them and heavy gold coins rained from it, bouncing off their heads and seats. Squinting up at the shamrock, Harry realized it was actually comprised of thousands of tiny little bearded men with red vests, each carrying a minute lamp of gold or green. "Leprechauns," said Mr. Weasley over the tumultuous applause of the crowd, many of whom were still fighting and rummaging around their seats to retrieve the gold. "There you go," Ron yelled happily, stuffing a fistful of gold coins into Harry's hand. "For the omnioculars. Now you've got to buy me a Christmas present. Ha!" The great shamrock dissolved and the leprechauns drifted down onto the field on the opposite side of the villa and settled themselves cross-legged to watch the match. "And now, ladies and gentlemen, kindly welcome the Bulgarian national Quidditch team. I give you Dimitrov." A scarlet-clad figure on a broomstick, moving so fast it was blurred, shot out from onto the field from an entrance far below, to wild applause from the Bulgarian supporters. "Ivanova!" A second scarlet-robed player zoomed out. "Zograf, Levski, Vulkanov, Volkov, and Crumb." That's him, yelled Ron, following Crumb with his omnioculars. Harry quickly focused his own. Victor Crumb was thin, dark, and sallow-skinned, with a large curved nose and thick black eyebrows. He looked like an overgrown bird of prey. It was hard to believe he was only 18. "And now, please greet the Irish national Quidditch team," yelled Bagman, "presenting Connolly, Ryan, Troy, Mullet, Moran, Quigley, and Lynch." 7 green blurs swept onto the field. Harry spun a small dial on the side of his omnioculars and slowed the players down enough to read the word Firebolt on each of their brooms and see their names embroidered in silver upon their backs. "And here, all the way from Egypt, our referee, acclaimed chair wizard of the International Association of Quidditch, Hassan Mostafa." A small and skinny wizard, completely bald but with a mustache to rival Uncle Vernon's, wearing robes of pure gold to match the stadium, strode out onto the field. A silver whistle was protruding from under the mustache, and he was carrying a large wooden crate under one arm, with his broomstick under the other. Harry spun the speed dial on his omnioculars back to normal, watching closely as Mostafa mounted his broomstick and kicked the crate open. 4 balls burst into the air, the scarlet quaffle, the 2 black bludgers, and, Harry saw for the briefest instant before it spit out of sight, the minuscule winged golden snitch. With a sharp blast on his whistle, Mostafa shot into the air after the balls. "And they're off!" screamed Bagman. "And it's Mullet, Troy, Moran, Dimitrov, back to Mullet, Troy, Levski, Moran." It was Quidditch as Harry had never seen it played before. He was pressing his omnioculars so hard to his glasses that they were cutting into the bridge of his nose. The speed of the players was incredible. The chasers were throwing the quaffle to one another so fast that Bagman only had time to say their names. Harry spun the slow dial on the right of his omnioculars again, pressed the play-by-play button on the top, and he was immediately watching in slow motion while glittering purple lettering flashed across the lenses and the noise of the crowd pounded against his eardrums. "Hawk's Head attacking formation," he read as he watched 3 Irish chasers zoom closely together, Troy in the center, slightly ahead of Mullet and Moran, bearing down upon the Bulgarians. "Pushkov ploy" flashed up next, as Ch8 made as though to dart upward with the quaffle, drawing away the Bulgarian chaser, Ivanova, and dropping the quaffle to Moran. One of the Bulgarian beaters, Volkov, swung hard at a passing bludger with his small club, knocking it into Moran's path. Moran ducked to avoid the bludger and dropped the quaffle, and Levski soared beneath, caught it. "Ch8 scores!" roared Bagman, and the stadium shuddered with a roar of applause and cheers. 10-0 Ireland. "What?" Harry yelled, looking wildly around his omnioculars. "But Levski's got the quaffle." "Harry, if you're not going to watch at normal speed, you're going to miss things," shouted Hermione, who was dancing up and down, waving her arms in the air while Troy did a lap of honor around the field. Harry looked quickly over the top of his omnioculars and saw the leprechauns watching from the sidelines had all risen into the air again and formed the great glittering shamrock. Across the field, the Vila were watching them sulkily. Furious with himself, Harry spun his speed dial back to normal as play resumed. Harry knew enough about Quidditch to see that the Irish chasers were superb. They worked as a seamless team, their movements so well coordinated that they appeared to be reading one another's minds as they positioned themselves. And the rosette on Harry's chest kept squeaking their names: Troy, Mullet, Moran. Within 10 minutes, Ireland had scored twice more, bringing their lead to 30-0 and causing a thunderous tide of roars and applause from the green-clad supporters. The match became still faster but more brutal. Volkov and Volkanov, the Bulgarian beaters, were whacking the bludgers as fiercely as possible at the Irish chasers, and they were starting to prevent them from using some of their best moves. Twice they were forced to scatter, and then finally, Ivanova managed to break through their ranks, dodge the keeper Ryan, and score Bulgaria's first goal. "Put your fingers in your ears," bellowed Mr. Weasley as the Vila started to dance in celebration. Harry screwed up his eyes too. He wanted to keep his mind on the game. After a few seconds, he chanced to glance at the field. The Vila had stopped dancing, and Bulgaria was once again in possession of the quaffle. "Dimitrov, Levski, Dimitrov, Ivanova. Oh, I say!" roared Bagman. 100,000 wizards gasped as the two seekers, Crumb and Lynch, plummeted through the center of the chasers so fast it looked as though they jumped from airplanes without parachutes. Harry followed their descent through his omnioculars, squinting to see where the snitch was. "They're going to crash!" screamed Hermione next to Harry. She was half right. At the very last second, Victor Crumb pulled out of the dive and spiraled off. Lynch, however, hit the ground with a dull thud that could be heard throughout the stadium. A huge groan rose from the Irish seats. "Fool," moaned Mr. Weasley. "Crumb was faking." "It's a timeout," yelled Bagman's voice, as trained meta-wizards hurry onto the field to examine Aidan Lynch. "He'll be okay. He only got plowed," Charlie said reassuringly to Ginny, who was hanging over the side of the box looking horror-struck, which is what Crumb was after, of course. Harry hastily pressed the replay and play-by-play buttons on his omnioculars, twiddled the speed dial, and put them back up to his eyes. He watched as Crumb and Lynch dived again in slow motion. "Wronski defensive fake, dangerous seeker diversion," read the shiny purple lettering across his lenses. He saw Crumb's face contorted with concentration as he pulled out of the dive just in time, while Lynch was flattened, and he understood. Crumb hadn't seen the snitch at all. He was just making Lynch copy him. Harry had never seen anyone fly like that. Crumb hardly looked as though he were using the broomstick at all. He moved so easily through the air that he looked unsupported and weightless. Harry turned his omnioculars back to normal and focused them on Crumb. He was now circling high above Lynch, who was being revived by medi-wizards with cups of potion. Harry, focusing still more closely upon Crumb's face, saw his dark eyes darting all over the ground 100 feet below. He was using the time, while Lynch was revived, to look for the snitch without interference. Lynch got to his feet at last, to loud cheers from the green-clad supporters, mounted his firebolt, kicked back off into the air. His revival seemed to give Ireland new heart. When Mustafa blew his whistle again, the chasers moved into action with a skill unrivaled by anything Harry had seen so far. After 15 more fast and furious minutes, Ireland had pulled ahead by 10 more goals. They were now leading by 130 points to 10, and the game was starting to get dirtier. as Mullet shot toward the goalposts yet again, clutching the quaffle tightly under her arm. The Bulgarian keeper, Zograf, flew out to meet her. Whatever happened was over so quickly Harry didn't catch it, but a scream of rage from the Irish crowd and Mustafa's long, shrill whistle blast told him it was a foul. And Mustafa takes the Bulgarian keeper to task for tobbing. That's excessive use of elbows, Bagman informed the roaring spectators. And yes, it's a penalty to Ireland. The leprechauns, who had risen angrily into the air like a swarm of glittering hornets when Mully had been fouled, now darted together to form the words, ha ha ha. The Vila on the other side of the field leapt to their face, tossed their hair angrily, and started to dance again. At once, the Weasley boys and Harry stuffed their fingers into their ears, but Hermione, who hadn't bothered, was soon tugging on Harry's arm. He turned to look at her, and she pulled his fingers impatiently out of his ears. "Look at the referee," she said, giggling. Harry looked down at the field. Hassan Mustafa had landed right in front of the dancing Vila and was acting very oddly indeed. He was flexing his muscles and smoothing his mustache excitedly. "Oh, now we can't have that," said Ludo Bagman, though he sounded highly amused. "Somebody slapped the referee." A Mediwizard came tearing across the field, his fingers stuffed into his own ears, and kicked Mustafa hard in the shins. Mustafa seemed to come to himself. Harry, watching through the omnioculars again, saw that he looked exceptionally embarrassed and was starting to shout at the Vila, who had stopped dancing and were looking mutinous. "And unless I'm mistaken, Mustafa is actually attempting to send off the Bulgarian team mascots," said Bagman's voice. "Now there's something we haven't seen before. Oh, this could turn nasty." It did. The Bulgarian beaters, Volkov and Volkanov, landed on either side of Mustafa and began arguing furiously with him, gesticulating towards the leprechauns, who were now gleefully forming the words he, he. Mustafa was not impressed by the Bulgarians' arguments. However, he was jabbing his finger into the air, clearly telling them to get flying again, and when they refused, he gave 2 short blasts on his whistle. "2 penalties for Ireland," shouted Bagman, and the Bulgarian crowd howled with anger. And Volkov and Volkanov had better get back on their brooms. Yes, there they go, and Troy takes the quaffle. Play now reached a level of ferocity beyond anything they had yet seen. The beaters on both sides were acting without mercy. Volkov and Volkanov in particular seemed not to care whether their clubs made contact with a bludger or a human as they swung them violently through the air. Dimitrov shot straight at Moran, who had the quaffle, nearly knocking her off the broom. "Foul!" roared the Irish supporters as one, standing up in a great wave of green. "Foul!" echoed Ludo Bagman's magically magnified voice. "Dimitrov skins Moran, just deliberately flying to collide there, and it's got to be another penalty. Yep, there's the whistle." The leprechauns had risen into the air again, and this time they formed a giant hand, which was making a very rude sign at the Vila across the field. At this, the Vila lost control. Instead of dancing, they launched themselves across the field and began throwing what seemed to be handfuls of fire at the leprechauns. Watching through his omnioculars, Harry saw they didn't look remotely beautiful now. On the contrary, their faces were elongating into sharp, cruel-beaked birds' heads, and long, scaly wings were bursting from their shoulders. "And that," yelled Mr. Weasley over the chaos of the crowd below, "is why you should never go for looks alone." Ministry wizards were flooding onto the field to separate the Vila and the leprechauns, but with little success. And meanwhile, the pitched battle below was nothing compared to the one taking place above. Harry turned this way and that, staring through his omnioculars as the quaffle changed hands with the speed of a bullet. Levski, Dimitrov, Moran, Troy, Mullet, Ivanova, Moran again, Moran scores! But the cheers of the Irish supporters were barely heard over the shrieks of the Vila, the blasts now issuing from the ministry members' wands, and the furious roars of the Bulgarians. The game recommenced immediately, and now Levski had the quaffle, and now Dimitrov. The Irish beater Quigley swung heavily at a passing bludger, and hit it as hard as possible toward Crumb, who did not duck quickly enough. It hit him full in the face. There was a deafening groan from the crowd. Crumb's nose had been broken, and there was blood everywhere, But Hassan Mustafa didn't blow the whistle. He was distracted, and Harry couldn't blame him. One of the Vila had thrown a handful of fire and set his broom tail on fire. Harry wanted someone to realize that Crumb was injured. Even though he was supporting Ireland, Crumb was the most exciting player on the field, and Ron obviously felt the same. "Come on, time out. He can't play like this. Look at him." "Look at Lynch," Harry yelled. The Irish seeker had suddenly gone into the dive, and Harry was sure this was not a fake. This was the real thing. "He's seen the snitch," Harry shouted. "He's seen it. Look at him go." Half the crowd seemed to realize what was happening. The Irish supporters rose in a great wave of green, screaming their seeker on. But Crumb was also diving. How he could see where he was going, Harry had no idea. There were flecks of blood flying through the air behind him. But he was catching up with Lynch as they hurtled toward the ground again. "They're going to crash," shrieked Hermione. "They're not," roared Ron. "Lynch is," yelled Harry, and he was right. For the second time, Lynch hit the ground with tremendous force and was immediately stampeded by a horde of angry Vila. The snitch, where's the snitch?" bellowed Charlie along the row. "He's got it, Crumb's got it, it's all over," shouted Harry. Crumb, with his red robes shining with blood from his nose, was rising gently into the air, his fist held high, a glint of gold in his hand. The scoreboard was flashing Bulgaria 160, Ireland 170. The crowd, who didn't seem to hardly have realized what was happening at first, then slowly, as though a great jumbo jet were revving up, the rumbling from the Ireland supporters grew louder and louder and erupted into screams of delight. "Ireland wins!" Bagman shouted, who, like the Irish, seemed to be taken aback by the sudden end of the match. "Crumb gets the snitch, but Ireland wins! Good heavens, I don't think any of us were expecting that." "What did he catch the snitch for?" Ron bellowed, even as he jumped up and down, applauding with his hands over his head. "He ended it when Ireland were 160 points ahead, the idiot." "No," said Harry. "He knew they were never going to catch up. The Irish chasers were just too good, so he wanted to end it on his terms, that's all." "He was very brave, wasn't he?" Hermione said, leaning forward to watch Crumb land as a swarm of Medi-Wizards blasted a path through the battling leprechauns and Vila to get to him. "He looks a terrible mess." Harry put his omnioculars to his eyes again. It was hard to see what was happening below, with leprechauns zooming delightedly all over the field, but he could just make out Crumb surrounded by Medi-Wizards. He looked surlier than ever and refused to let them help him. His team members were around him, shaking their heads and looking dejected. A short way away, the Irish players were dancing gleefully in a shower of gold descending from their mascots. Flags were waving all over the stadium. The Irish national anthem blared from all sides, and the Vila were shrinking back to their usual beautiful selves now, though looking dispirited and forlorn. "Well, we fought bravely," said a gloomy voice behind Harry. He looked around. It was the Bulgarian Minister of Magic. "You can speak English?" said Fudge, sounding outraged. "And you've been letting me mime everything all day?" "Well, it was very funny," said the Bulgarian Minister, shrugging. "And as the Irish team performs a lap of honor, flanked by their mascots, the Quidditch World Cup itself is brought into the top box," roared Bagman. Harry's eyes were suddenly dazzled by a blinding white light as the top box was magically illuminated so that everyone in the stands could see inside. Squinting toward the entrance, he saw two panting wizards carrying a vast golden cup into the box, which they handed to Cornelius Fudge, who was looking very disgruntled that he'd been using sign language all day for nothing. "Let's have a really loud hand for the gallant losers, Bulgaria!" Bagman shouted. And up the stairs into the box came the 7 defeated Bulgarian players. The crowd below was applauding appreciatively. Harry could see thousands and thousands of omniocular lenses flashing and winking in their direction. One by one, the Bulgarians filed toward the rows of seats in the box, and Bagman called out each of their names as they shook hands with their own minister and then with Fudge. Crumb, who was last in line, looked a real mess. 2 black eyes were blooming spectacularly on his bloody face. He was still holding the snitch, and Harry noticed that he seemed much less coordinated on the ground. He was slightly duck-footed and distinctly round-shouldered, but when Crumb's name was mentioned, the whole stadium gave him a resounding, ear-splitting roar. And then came the Irish team. Ada Lynch was being supported by Moran and Connolly, The second crash seemed to have dazed him, and his eyes looked strangely unfocused. But he grinned happily as Troy and Quigley lifted the cup into the air and the crowd below thundered its approval. Harry's hands were numb with clapping. At last, when the Irish team had left the box to perform another lap of honor on their brooms, Aidan Lynch on the back of Connolly's, clutching round his waist and still grinning in a strange kind of way. Bagman pointed his wand at his throat and muttered, "Quietus." "Oh, they'll be talking about this one for years," he said hoarsely. "A really unexpected twist that, shame it couldn't have lasted longer. Oh, yes, I owe you. How much?" For Fred and George had just scrambled over the backs of their seats and were standing in front of Ludo Bagman with broad grins on their faces and their hands outstretched. And that's the end of that chapter.